In the middle of the night at a hostel in Bangkok, why does the protagonist, who is exploring with a travel companion, suddenly fall into a kidnapping crisis? Is it the companion's conspiracy or something else? Can she escape safely? Stay tuned for thrilling stories. Subscribe now to join us on this adventure. We stumbled into a small ravine and slid down the side, landing hard at the bottom. I could hear the men searching above us, their voices getting closer. Mark and I pressed ourselves against the dirt wall, trying to stay silent. "They went this way," one of the men shouted. I held my breath, praying they wouldn't find us. The seconds stretched into minutes, and I could hear my own heartbeat in my ears. Then the voices started to fade. They were moving away. We stayed still, hardly daring to breathe until we were sure they were gone. Finally, I whispered, "We need to keep moving." Mark nodded and we climbed out of the ravine. Careful to stay quiet. We made our way through the woods, putting as much distance between us and the men as we could. It was dark now and the forest was eerily quiet. After what felt like hours, we stumbled onto another road. We had no idea where we were, but we followed it, hoping it would lead us to safety. Eventually we saw headlights in the distance. A car was coming. We stepped out onto the road and waved it down. The car stopped and a middle-aged couple rolled down the window. "Are you okay?" the woman asked, concerning her voice. "We need help," I said. "Please just take us to the nearest town." They let us in and we explained what had happened. As they drove, they took us to the nearest police station, where we reported everything. The police took our statement and said they would investigate, but I didn't have much hope they would find the men. We were exhausted but grateful to be safe. The couple who had picked us up offered to drive us to a nearby motel, and we accepted. As we settled into the motel room, I couldn't shake the fear that still clung to me. We tried to get some sleep, but every noise outside made me jump. I kept thinking about what those men had said in the diner, and how close we had come to being their next victims. It was a long night, but eventually exhaustion took over and I drifted off. The next morning we decided to cut our trip short and head home. We were both shaken by what had happened and just wanted to put as much distance as possible between us and that town. As we drove, we stayed vigilant, watching for any sign of the truck. It took a while, but we finally started to feel a bit safer. We knew we had been lucky to get away. The sun was setting over the vast expanse of the African bush. As my brother and I set up camp for the night, the sounds of the wilderness echoing all around us. We had ventured deep into the heart of the bush. Far from civilization, seeking adventure and the chance to connect with nature. But as darkness fell and the stars began to twinkle overhead, a sense of unease settled over us like a heavy blanket. The bush was alive, with the sounds of nocturnal creatures, their calls and cries echoing through the night. But there was something else out there, something darker and more sinister lurking in the shadows. We huddled around the campfire, our senses on high alert as we listened to the sounds of the night. But as the hours passed and the darkness deepened, a new sound reached our ears, the distant crackle of gunfire, echoing through the stillness like a warning from the depths of the wilderness. Fear set my heart out, as I realized while we were hearing poachers, ruthless men, who would stop at nothing to get what they wanted. We had stumbled upon their illegal activities, and now our lives were in grave danger. My brother and I exchanged a silent glance, our eyes wide with fear, as we realized the gravity of our situation. We were alone in the African bush, with no one to turn to for help, and the poachers were closing in on us with each passing moment. We knew we had to act fast if we were to have any hope of surviving. The night, with trembling hands, we doused the campfire and gathered our belongings, moving quickly and quietly through the darkness, trying to put as much distance between ourselves and the poachers as possible. But no matter how fast we ran, the sound of gunfire grew louder and more menacing, with each passing moment drawing ever closer to our hiding place in the heart of the bush. Panic surged through my veins as I realized that we were being hunted, that the poachers were closing in on us with ruthless determination. We had nowhere to run, nowhere to hide, and our only hope of survival lay in outsmarting our proc source and finding a way to escape the bush alive. We pressed on through the night, our hearts pounding in our chests as we navigated the treacherous terrain, our senses on high alert for any sign of danger. But as dawn broke over the horizon and the first light of morning pierced the darkness, we knew that we were running out of time. Exhausted and on the brink of collapse, we stumbled upon a small clearing in the bush, our breath coming in like a gasp as we collapsed to the ground. Our bodies battered and bruised from our harrowing ordeal. But as we lay there gasping for breath and praying for deliverance, a miracle occurred at the sound of approaching voices shouting and calling out to us in the distance. Relief flooded through me as I realized that we were saved by the timely arrival of a group of park rangers who had come to our rescue just in the nick of time. They led us to safety, their faces grim with determination, as they explained the gravity of the situation the poachers had been apprehending there. Our illegal activities brought to an end, and we were safe once more. As we emerged from the bush, blinking in the bright light of day, I couldn't help but feel a sense of profound gratitude for the park rangers who had saved our lives and a newfound respect for the untamed wilderness of the African bush. I worked at graveyard shift at this 24-hour convenience store. It's not the most glamorous job, but it pays the bills. One night things got real weird. There was this car parked outside for hours, just sitting there with the engine money. I thought maybe they were waiting for someone, so I didn't think much of it at first. Hours went by and the car was still there. I started to get a little uneasy. Who just sits in their car for that long? Around 3:00 a.m. The driver finally came inside. He was a tall guy, looked to be in his 30s, with wild eyes and a jittery demeanor. He walked up to the counter and started pacing back and forth, muttering to himself. I tried to act normal, but I could feel the tension in the air. He kept glancing over his shoulder like he was expecting someone to come after him. I asked if he needed help with anything, but he just shook his head and kept pacing. I could see the bulge of something in his jacket pocket, and my heart started racing. Was he armed? I didn't want to jump to conclusions, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. He finally stopped pacing and stared at me with those wild eyes. You ever feel like you're being watched? He asked, his voice low and intense. I didn't know what to say. I just nodded, trying to play it cool. He started rambling about how he was being followed, how he needed to lay low for a while. I tried to calm him down, but he was on edge like he was ready to bolt at any moment. I didn't want to escalate the situation, so I just listened, hoping he would leave soon. But he didn't leave. He stayed for what felt like hours, pacing and muttering to himself. I kept an eye on him, ready to hit the panic button under the counter if things got out of hand. Eventually he seemed to calm down a bit and wandered off to the back of the store. I took the opportunity to grab my phone and discreetly call the police. I explained the situation to them, and they said they would send someone over as soon as they could. I felt a little better knowing help was on the way, but I was still on edge. I kept watching the guy out of the corner of my eye as he wandered around the store picking up random items and putting them back down. He seemed restless, like he couldn't sit still for more than a few seconds. Suddenly he froze, his eyes widening in fear. He turned to me, his face pale. They found me. He whispered, his voice trembling. I have to get out of here before I could react. He bolted for the door and disappeared into the night. I stood there stunned, not sure what to do. I wanted to follow him, make sure he was okay, but I knew it was too dangerous. I waited anxiously for the police to arrive, hoping they would catch up with him and make sure he was safe. When they finally got there, I told them everything that had happened. They searched the area, but didn't find any sign of the guy. They said they would keep an eye out for him, and let me know if they found anything. I spent the rest of the night on edge, jumping at every little sound. I couldn't shake the feeling that something bad was going to happen, but when the sun finally came up and my shift ended, I was relieved to make it out of there in one piece. I don't know what happened to that guy, but I hope he's okay. Working the graveyard shift, you see all kinds of strange things, but that night was something else entirely. It's a reminder that you never know what might happen when you're working alone. In the middle of the night, I was driving alone in the outskirts of Las Vegas, the city lights fading behind me as I headed towards the empty desert. The road stretched out ahead, dark and desolate, with nothing but the occasional cactus and tumbleweed company. It was late and I was tired, but I wanted to make it to my destination before calling in a night. As I drove, I noticed headlights in my rearview mirror. At first, I didn't think much of it, assuming it was just another traveler on the road, but then the car got closer, tailgating me and flashing its high beams. I frowned, wondering why they were driving so aggressively. I tried to ignore them, focusing on the road ahead, but the car didn't let up, swerving dangerously close to my bumper and then falling back again. I felt a knot of fear in my stomach, realizing that this was no ordinary driver. They were deliberately trying to intimidate me. I sped up hoping to lose them, but they matched my speed, staying right on my tail. Panic surged through me as I realized they weren't going to give up easily. I had to do something before they caused an accident. I glanced to my phone, debating whether to call the police, but I didn't want to take my eyes off the road for even a second. Instead, I focused on staying calm and getting away from the other car. I saw it turn off up ahead, a narrow dirt road leading into the desert. Without thinking, I veered off the highway and onto the rough terrain. The car followed its headlights, bobbing over the bumps and dips in the road. I pushed my car to its limits, weaving through the desert landscape in a desperate attempt to escape. But no matter how fast I drove or how many twists and turns I made, the other car stayed right behind me like a shadow that wouldn't let go. I glanced in my rearview mirror and saw the driver's face illuminated by the glow of the dashboard lights. They were wearing a ski mask. Their eyes fixed on me with a chilling intensity. My blood ran cold as I realized they weren't just trying to scare me. They meant to do me harm. I felt a surge of adrenaline as I realized I was in a fight for my life. I had to outsmart my pursuer and find a way to get help, but out here in the middle of nowhere, with no one around. 4 miles that seemed like an impossible task. I spotted a cluster of rocks up ahead, a potential hiding spot where I could make a stand. I slowed down, waiting until the last possible moment before swerving off the road and ducking behind the boulders. The other car screeched to a halt behind me, its headlights cutting through the darkness like twin searchlights. I held my breath waiting for them to find me, but seconds ticked by and there was no sign of movement. I risked a glance around the edge of the rock, my heart pounding in my chest. The other car was parked a few yards away, its engine idling, but there was no sign of the driver. I knew I couldn't stay hidden forever. Sooner or later they would find me and then I would be defenseless. I had to come up with a plan, and fast. I reached into the glove compartment and grabbed a flashlight, flicking it on and shining it towards the other car. I didn't see anyone inside, but that didn't mean they weren't out there waiting for me to make a move. I took a deep breath and stepped out from behind the rocks, keeping the flashlight trained on the other car. I moved slowly, my senses on high alert, ready for anything. Suddenly I heard a noise behind me, the crunch of gravel underfoot. I spun around the beam of my flashlight, cutting through the darkness, and that's when I saw them, the driver emerging from the shadows with a knife in their hand. I froze, my mind racing as I tried to think of a way out of this nightmare, but before I could react, they lunged at me. The glint of the blade flashing in. The moonlight instinct took over and I dodged out of the way, feeling the rush of arrest. The knife sliced through the space where I had been standing. Adrenaline surged through me as I fought back, swimming the flashlight like a weapon and aiming for their head. There was a sickening thud as the flashlight connected with their skull and they stumbled backwards. Dazed, I didn't hesitate. I ran, my feet pounding against a hard desert ground as I sprinted towards my car. I could hear them behind me cursing and shouting threats, but I didn't look back. I reached my car and jumped inside, slamming the door shut, unlocking it behind me. I started the engine and peeled out of the dirt road, leaving the other car and its driver far behind me. As I drove, my hand shook on the wheel and tears streamed down my face, but I didn't stop until I reached the safety of the nearest town, where I called the police and reported what had happened. They promised to investigate, but I knew it would be hard to find someone in the vast expanse of the desert. I never found out who was chasing me that night or why they had targeted me, but I'll never forget the terror I felt as I fought for my life in the middle of the desert, with no one around to help. I was staying at a small, cheap hostel in Bangkok, trying to make my trip to Thailand as budget-friendly as possible. The place was run down, but had a certain charm, with a common area where travelers would gather to share stories. That's where I met. Sarah seemed friendly and approachable, a fellow traveler from Australia. We clicked immediately, bonding over our love of adventure and exploring new places. She had been traveling through Southeast Asia for a few months and had lots of tips and recommendations. We decided to explore the city together, and I felt lucky to have found a travel buddy so quickly. We spent the next few days visiting temples, markets, and street food stalls. Sarah knew all the best spots, and it felt like having a personal tour guide. One evening she suggested we visit a lesser-known night market outside the tourist areas. She said it was a hidden gem, with the best food and unique souvenirs. We took a tuk to the market, and as we wandered through the stalls, I noticed it was much quieter than the bustling markets in the city center. Sarah led the way, guiding me through narrow alleys until we reached a small dimly lit bar. She suggested we go in for a drink, and though I was a bit hesitant, I followed her. The bar was nearly empty, just a few locals and a couple of other foreigners. We sat at a table near the back and Sarah ordered drinks for us as we chatted. I started feeling a bit lightheaded. I chopped it up to the heat and the long day of walking, but then my fishing began to blur. I looked at Sarah trying to tell her something was wrong, but she just smiled and kept talking. My head felt heavy and I struggled to stay awake. I realized too late that something was very wrong. The last thing I saw before everything went black was Sarah's calculating expression. When I woke up, I was in a dark, cold room. My hands and feet were tied and my head was pounding. Panic set in. As I tried to remember what happened, I could hear muffled voices outside the door, speaking in a language I didn't understand. I struggled against the ropes, but they were too tight. The door creaked open and Ian stepped in his face, hidden in shadows. He spoke to me in broken English, telling me to stay quiet and that everything would be over soon. My heart raced as I realized I had been kidnapped. I asked about Sarah, but the man just laughed and left the room. I spent what felt like hours in that room, fear gripping me with every passing minute. Eventually the door opened again, and two men came in. They untied my feet and dragged me out into a dimly lit hallway. I was too weak to fight back my body, still recovering from whatever they had drugged me with. They led me into a larger room that looked like an old abandoned medical facility. My stomach churned as I saw surgical equipment and blood stains on the floor. I realized with horror that they were planning to harvest my organs. Desperation gave me a surge of strength. I struggled and screamed trying to break free. One of the men punched me in the stomach, and I doubled over in pain. They strapped me to a table, and I felt tears streaming down my face. I couldn't believe this was happening. Just as they were preparing to sedate me again, I heard a commotion outside. Shouts and banging echoed through the building. The men exchanged worried glances, and one of them left a room to check what was happening. The remaining men hesitated, clearly unsure of what to do. The door burst open and a group of police officers stormed in. The man beside me tried to run, but he was quickly subdued. The officers untied me and helped me off the table, speaking calmly and reassuringly. They told me I was safe now, and that they had been tracking this Iran trafficking ring for months. I was taken to a hospital where I was treated for my injuries and monitored for any lasting effects of the drugs. The police explained that they had been tipped off by another traveler who had a close call with Sarah but managed to escape. They had been following her and found the eye out. Sarah and the men were arrested and I was able to return home safely. The experience left me traumatized and I struggled with nightmares for a long time, but I was grateful to be alive and determined to be more cautious in the future. Traveling is supposed to be about adventure and discovery, but I learned the hard way that not everyone you meet has good intentions. I'm still passionate about exploring the world, but now I'm much more careful about who I trust. I parked my van in a remote spot in the backwoods of Louisiana, hoping for a quiet night. The area was thick with trees and underbrush, and the nearest town was miles away. I was on a break from work, looking to enjoy some solitude. The forest was dense and silent, with only the occasional rustle of leaves breaking the stillness. After setting up camp, I cooked a simple dinner on my portable stove and settled in for the evening. The air was cold and the sky was clear as darkness fell. I locked the doors of my van, feeling secure in my isolation. I read for a while, the silence of the forest wrapping around me like a blanket. It must have been close to midnight when I first heard the sound. It was a distant, muffled noise, like something heavy moving through the trees. I dismissed it as an animal, but my nerves were on edge. I continued reading, but the noise grew louder, closer. I turned off my light and listened, my heart pounding, voices low and rough carried on the wind. They were getting nearer. I peered out the small window, straining to see through the darkness. Figures moved in the shadows carrying rifles. My blood ran cold. Poachers, I thought, hoping they wouldn't notice me. Suddenly a flashlight beam cut through the darkness, sweeping over the trees and landing on my van. Panic surged through me. I ducked down, hoping they hadn't seen me. The voices grew louder, and I could make out words now. Over here looks like a camp. My breath caught in my throat. I heard footsteps approaching, crunching on the gravel. I had to do something, grabbing my keys. I considered driving away, but the fear of making noise and drawing attention stopped me. Check it out. Maybe it's a game warden. One of the men said, his voice closer. Now I realized with horror. They thought I was there to bust them. The door handle rattled and I held my breath locked. One of them grunted. We need to find out who's inside. I had to act fast. I quietly climbed into the driver's seat, keys in hand, and turned the ignition. The engine roared to life and I slammed it into reverse, backing away from the men. Shouts erupted as they realized I was escaping. Shots rang out and a bullet shattered the rear window. I floored the gas, heart pounding, as I sped down the dirt road. The fan bounced and jolted over the uneven terrain, but I didn't dare slow. Down in the rearview mirror I saw headlights. They were following me. I took a sharp turn, hoping to lose them in the maze of back roads. The fan skipped tires, struggling but I managed to stay on the road. The headlights were still there, getting closer. Panic threatened to overwhelm me, but I forced myself to focus. I remembered a narrow trail I had passed earlier, barely wide enough for the van. I swerved onto it. Branches scraping the sides and the headlights behind me. Swerved too. They were relentless. The trail twisted and turned and I fought to keep control. Suddenly the trees opened up and I found myself on the edge of a steep hill. I slammed on the brakes, skidding to a stop. The truck behind me wasn't as lucky. It barreled out of the trees and crashed into the side of my van, sending us both over the edge. The world spun as we tumbled down the hill. The fan rolled, clash shattering and end crunch cring. I was thrown around every impact, sending pain through my body. Finally we to a stop at the bottom. The silence was deafening. Dazed, I crawled out of the wreckage. My body ached, but I could move. I had to get away before they found me. I stumbled through the trees, trying to put as much distance between myself and the crash as possible. Voices echoed in the distance. Angry and frantic, they were searching for me. I kept moving, ignoring the pain and exhaustion. The forest was a maze, but I hoped to find a road or some sign of civilization. Hours passed, the night seemed endless and I was losing hope. Then, in the faint light of dawn, I saw a cabin. It looked abandoned, but it was shelter. I forced myself to the door and found it unlocked. Inside, it was dark and musty but safe. I collapsed on the floor, too exhausted to move. I listened for any sounds of pursuit, but heard nothing. I had made it. I was safe for now. When the sun rose, I ventured out cautious and worried. I needed to find help. After hours of walking, I stumbled upon a road and flight down a passing car. The driver took one look at me and called the police. It took a while to explain what happened, but they eventually believed me. The poachers were caught, their operation shut down. I was treated for my injuries and given a ride back to town. The experience left me shaken and wary of the wilderness. I still love the solitude and beauty of nature, but I'm more cautious now. I bought the laptop from a guy on Craigslist. My old one had crashed and I needed a replacement fast for work. The guy seemed normal enough, a little nervous maybe, but he handed it over with no issues. I got home, booted it up and everything seemed fine. It was only that night, while I was going through the files, that I found something strange. There was a folder hidden deep in the system. It didn't have a name, just a string of random characters. I almost ignored it, but curiosity got the better of me. Inside were hundreds of files, videos, documents, images. It didn't take long to realize they were all illegal, horrific stuff. I shut the laptop, heart pounding. I decided to call the police, but first I needed some air. I walked out onto my balcony trying to calm down. That's when I noticed a car parked across the street. It was the same car the guy had driven. When he sold me the laptop, the hairs on my neck stood up. Was he watching me? I went back inside and called 911. I told them everything about the laptop and the files. They said someone would come over right away. I stayed near the window keeping an eye on the car. It hadn't moved. Minutes later the doorbell rang. I opened the door to two officers. I showed them the laptop and the files. They took it seriously, which was a relief. One of the officers took the laptop, while the other stayed with me asking questions. Suddenly, there was a loud crash from the front door. The officer with me drew his weapon and told me to stay put. I heard shouting, followed by gunshots. The officer guarding me told me to hide. I ducked into the bathroom trembling after what felt like hours. The noise stopped. The officer came to get me. The other officer was down and the guy from Craigslist was dead. It turns out he had been watching me, and when he saw the cops he panicked. The police took my statement and assured me they'd handle everything. I stayed with a friend that night too, scared to be alone. The next day they contacted me to say the files on the laptop were part of a larger investigation. The guy had been involved in some serious criminal activities. I was relieved. It was over, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I moved to a new apartment, hoping a change of scenery would help. It took a while, but life started to feel normal again. I got a new laptop, this time from a store. I still think about that night sometimes, especially when I see a car park too long outside my building. I was driving through New Mexico, on my way to visit family, and it was getting late. I decided to stop at a small motel off the highway. It looked old, but I was tired and needed a place to rest. The sign said vacancy in flickering neon. I pulled into the gravel parking lot and walked to the office. The receptionist was an older woman. Her face lined with age, but she had a friendly smile. She handed me the key to roommate and told me to have a good night. I thanked her and went to my room. It was small but clean. I put my bag on the bed and decided to take a shower as I was trying off. I noticed a pamphlet on the nightstand. It was about the history of the motel. Apparently it had been there since the 1950s and had seen better days. There were photos of happy families and travelers from years past. I skimmed through it and noticed a small section about local legends. It mentioned that some guests had disappeared over the years, but it was written off as folklore. I went to bed, but I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling the pamphlet gave me around midnight. I heard a faint noise outside my door. It sounded like footsteps. I got up and peered through the peephole, but saw nothing. I figured it was just another guest and went back to bed. The next morning, I went to the office to check out. The older woman was there, but she seemed different, more distant. I asked her about the pamphlet and the stories of people disappearing. She looked at me with a blank expression and said those are just old tales. Don't worry about it. As I left, I saw a maintenance worker near the parking lot. He looked like he had been working there for years. I decided to ask him about the motel's history. He glanced around nervously before speaking in a low voice. People have gone missing here, but no one talks about it. Management wants to keep it quiet. They say it's bad for business. My heart skipped a beat. What do you mean? What happened to them? He shook his head. No one knows for sure. They just vanish. Best to keep to yourself and not ask too many questions. I thanked him and got into my car. As I drove away, I couldn't stop thinking about what he said that night. I stay at a different motel in a nearby town. I tried to put it out of my mind, but curiosity got the better of me. I decided to do some research. I went to the local library and searched for information about the motel. I found old newspaper articles about people going missing. The articles were vague, but there were enough of them to make me worry. One article mentioned a young couple who vanished after staying there. Another talked about a traveling salesman who was never seen again. I couldn't believe it. How could something like this go unnoticed? I went back to the motel the next day, pretending I had left something behind. The older woman was still at the desk. I asked if she had seen my missing item, and she let me check my old room. As I searched the room, I noticed a small door in the closet that I hadn't seen before. It was partially hidden behind a stack of old blankets. I opened it and found a narrow staircase leading down to a dark basement. My heart raced as I descended the stairs. The basement was damp and musty. I sawed furniture and boxes covered in dust. Then I noticed something that made my blood run cold. There were personal items, wallets, bags and clothes strewn across the floor. I recognized some of them from the photos in the pamphlet. I turned to leave, but heard footsteps above me. Panic set in. I hid behind a stack of boxes and waited. The older woman and a man I hadn't seen before came down the stairs. They were talking in hushed voices. We need to move these soon. The man said someone's going to notice. The woman nodded. I know, but it's getting harder. People are asking questions. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. They were involved in the disappearances. I had to get out of there before they found me. I waited until they left and then made my way back up the stairs as quietly as possible. I slipped out of the room and landed to my car. My hands were shaking as I started the engine and sped away. I drove straight to the nearest police station and told them everything. At first they seemed skeptical, but when I showed them the articles and described what I had seen, they agreed to investigate. A few days later I got a call from the police. They had found the basement and the evidence I described. The motel owners were arrested and the motel was shut down. The story made the local news and I was relieved that the truth had finally come out, but the experience haunted me. I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched and I avoided motels for a long time. Even now I still think about the people who disappeared and wonder what really happened to them. It's something that will stay with me forever. We've been planning the camping trip for months, me, Josh, Emily and Sarah. The Catskills sounded perfect, peaceful and away from everything. We loaded up the car and set off early Friday morning, excited for a weekend of hiking and campfires. The drive was long but beautiful, winding roads through dense forests. We reached our campsite in the late afternoon and the sun was just starting to set behind the trees. Setting up camp was fun. Josh struggled with the tent, while Emily and Sarah laughed and tried to help. I started a fire and soon we had everything ready. As the sky darkened, we sat around the fire, roasting marshmallows and telling stories. It felt great to be out there, away from the noise of the city. Around midnight we heard a rustling in the bushes. We all froze, staring into the darkness. Josh grabbed a flashlight and shone it towards the noise. A raccoon darted out and we all laughed relieved. It wasn't anything worse. We decided to call it a night and headed into our tents. I fell asleep, almost instantly tired from the day's activities. Sometime in the middle of the night I woke up to a loud snap. It sounded like a branch breaking, but closer. I sat up listening there. It was again followed by a low, grumbling voice. My heart started to race. I unzipped the tent quietly and peeked outside in the dim moonlight. I saw a shadow moving near the edge of our campsite. It looked like a man. I crawled out of the tent trying not to make a sound. Josh stirred and woke up whispering, "What's going on?" I motioned for him to be quiet and pointed towards the shadow. We both watched as the figure moved closer, now clearly a man, with a long beard and wild hair. He was muttering to himself, looking around like he was searching for something. Josh and I stayed low, hoping he wouldn't see us. The man walked around the campsite, poking our cur and mumbling. I couldn't make out what he was saying, but he sounded angry. After a few minutes, he walked off into the woods. We waited tense until we were sure he was gone. Then we quietly woke Emily and Sarah, explaining what we saw. None of us could sleep after that. We sat by the fire, keeping it low, and talked about what to do. Emily suggested pack up and leaving, but it was pitch dark and navigating the trails would be dangerous. We decided to stay put and leave at first light. We took turns keeping watch, but the night passed without any more incidents. At dawn, we quickly packed up our things and started hiking back to the car. The forest felt different, more menacing. Every sound made us jump. We were about halfway back when Sarah screamed. We turned to see her foot caught in a snare, simple but painful trap that yanked her leg up into the air. Josh and I rushed to free her while Emily kept watch. We managed to get Sarah free, but she was hurt and couldn't walk properly. Josh and I took turns supporting her as we continued. Our pace was slow and we were all on edge. We hadn't gone much further when we found another trap, this one a pit covered with leaves and branches. It was clear now that someone was trying to catch us. Panic set in. We knew we had to move faster, but Sarah was slowing us down. Emily found a sturdy branch, and we used it as a makeshift crutch for her till whole time. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. The forest was too quiet, the birds and animals seemingly gone. Then we heard it, the same crumbling voice from the night before, closer this time. We ducked behind a large rock, peering out to see the bearded man again. He was walking along the trail inspecting his traps. He looked furious, kicking at the dirt and shouting to himself. We waited until he moved past us before continuing. Our progress was slow and every step felt like a gamble. We were constantly scanning for more traps and listening for the man. After what felt like hours, we finally reached the edge of the forest and saw the car. Relief washed over us, but it was short-lived. The man was there standing by the car, his eyes wild and angry. We froze, unsure of what to do. He saw us and started shouting, accusing us of trying to steal from him. Josh tried to reason with him, but the man wasn't listening. He pulled out a knife and started towards us. We packed away trying to think of a way out. Just then a ranger's truck appeared on the road. The man hesitated, giving us a chance to run. The ranger saw what was happening and stopped jumping out of his truck with his hand on his gun. He shouted for the man to drop the knife. The man looked at us, then back at the ranger, before finally dropping the knife and raising his hands. The ranger called for backup and took the man into custody. We explained what had happened and he assured us we were safe. Now it turned out. The man was a survivalist who had been living in the woods for years, paranoid and convinced everyone was out to get him. He'd set traps to protect his territory. Not realizing how dangerous they were, we drove back to the city in silence, still shaken from the ordeal. The trip that was supposed to be a fun getaway had turned into a nightmare. I was babysitting for the Buckinghams one Friday night. They had a nice house in a quiet suburb and their son, Tommy, was always well behaved. It was supposed to be an easy job: put Tommy to bed, watch some TV and get paid. I had no idea how wrong I was. Tommy was already in his pajamas. When I arrived, Mrs. Buckingham gave me the usual rundown. Tommy's bedtime is at 8:30. Snacks are in the kitchen, call if you need anything. They left and it was just me and Tommy. We played a few games and then I let him watch some cartoons. While I scrolled through my phone, everything seemed normal until I noticed Tommy kept glancing at the door. I asked him something was wrong and he just shook his head. I didn't think much of it at the time. After dinner, I told Tommy it was time to get ready for bed. He protested a bit, but eventually went upstairs. I tucked him in, read him a story and he fell asleep pretty quickly. I went back downstairs and settled on the couch, ready for a quiet evening. Around 9:00 p.m. I heard a noise coming from upstairs. It sounded like whispering. I thought Tommy might be talking in his sleep, so I went to check on him. When I opened his door, I saw the glow of a screen under his blanket. He had a tablet. "Tommy, what are you doing?" "It's bedtime," I said, pulling the blanket off. He looked scared and tried to hide the tablet. "I'm sorry," he said, "I was just talking to my friend." I took the tablet from him and saw a chat window open. The messages were from someone named Mike. My heart sank when I read the messages. They were asking Tommy about his house, who was with him, and if the babysitter was pretty. The last message sent chills down my spine. "I'm coming to visit." I immediately shut off the tablet and asked Tommy how he knew this MIC. He told me he met him online while playing games. I told Tommy to stay in his room and lock the door. I went downstairs and called the police, explaining everything to them. They said they'd send someone over right away. While I waited, I locked all the doors and windows. I kept peeking outside, expecting to see someone lurking in the shadows. The minutes felt like hours. I was scared but tried to stay calm for Tommy's sake. Then there was a knock at the door. It was soft at first, then more insistent. I looked through the people, but saw nothing. My heart was pounding. I peed away from the door, my mind racing with fear. Another knock led this time, then a voice. "Hey, I know you're in there, open up." It was a man's voice, deep and threatening. I cracked a kitchen knife in it behind the couch, praying the police would arrive soon. The knocking turned into banging open the door, or I'll break it down, the voice yelled. I could hear the doorknob rattling and the door creaking under the pressure. I clutched the knife tighter, my hand shaking just when I thought the door would give in. I heard sirens in the distance. The banging stopped and I peeked out from behind the couch. The man was gone. The police arrived a few moments later, and I ran to open the door for them. I told the officers everything. They checked the house and the surroundings, but didn't find anyone. They took the tablet as evidence and assured me they would investigate. I called the Buckinghams and explained what happened. They rushed home terrified and grateful that Tommy and I were safe that night. I couldn't sleep. Every little noise made me jump. I kept thinking about how easily it could have gone differently. The police never caught the guy, but they did trace the messages back to a known predator. The Buckinghams were more careful with Tommy's online activities. After that, and I decided to stick to babysitting during the day. The experience left me shaken. I still babysit, but I'm much more cautious now. I always keep an eye on what the kids are doing online and make sure all the doors are locked. I was excited to babysit at the mansion. It was the biggest house I had ever seen, with long hallways, rooms I could get lost in, and expensive furniture everywhere. The pay was great and the kids, Emily and Jake, were sweet. The parents, Mr. and Mrs. Thompson, seemed nice enough too. They gave me a quick tour, explained the house rules and left for their event. The night started off easy. The kids played in the huge living room while I made them dinner. We watched a movie and I got them to bed without any trouble. By 9:00 p.m., I was alone in the large, quiet house. I settled on the couch with a book and a cup of tea, enjoying the peacefulness. Around 10 p.m., I heard a noise. It sounded like a door closing softly. I put my book down and listened. The house was quiet again. I shook it off, thinking it was just the old house settling, but then I heard it again closer. This time I got up and checked on the kids. They were fast asleep. I decided to look around as I walked through that house. I noticed a light on in Mr. Thompson's office. I was sure it had been off earlier. My heart started to race. I pushed the door open slowly and saw that the room was empty, but the light was definitely on. I turned it off and backed out of the room, feeling uneasy. I went back to the living room, but I couldn't relax. I kept hearing faint noises like footsteps, but every time I checked there was nothing there. Then I heard a door creak open, and this time it wasn't subtle. It was coming from the basement. I took a deep breath and decided to investigate. I found the basement door slightly ajar. The basement was dark and the light switch didn't seem to work. I grabbed a flashlight from the kitchen and headed down the stairs. The beam of light cut through the darkness, revealing shelves of storage boxes and old furniture. I scanned the room and saw nothing unusual until I reached the back corner. There, I found a door slightly open. I pushed it wider with a trembling hand. Inside the small room I found a desk covered in papers and files. There was a safe, its door slightly open. I glanced through the papers and realized there were financial documents, names and numbers that didn't make much sense to me, but one H stood out, laundering. My stomach dropped. The Thompsons were involved in something illegal. I heard a noise upstairs and quickly turned off the flashlight. Footsteps echoed through the house. I stayed still listening. It sounded like multiple people moving around. Panic set in. I had to get back to the kids. I slowly made my way up the stairs, every creep of the W making me wince. When I reached the top, I saw shadows moving in the hallway. I ducked back, heart pounding. I needed to get to the kids without being seen. I crept along the walls, staying in the shadows, and made it to the kids' room. I woke them quietly, telling them we needed to hide. Emily and Jake were scared but did. As I said, we hid in their closet, surrounded by toys and clothes. I heard voices outside the door, men talking in hushed tones. They were looking for something. I held my breath, praying they wouldn't check the closet. The door creaked open and I heard footsteps entering the room. I could see their shadows through the crack in the closet door. Check the office again. One of the men said they must have hidden it somewhere. They left the room and I let out a silent sigh of We needed to get out of the house. I led the kids out of the closet and towards the back door. The house was a maze and it was hard to avoid the men. We made it to the kitchen and I grabbed the phone to call the police, but the line was dead. They must have cut it. I led the kids to the back door, but just as I opened it, one of the men spotted us. "Hey," he shouted. We ran into the yard, my heart racing. I heard him chasing us, his footsteps getting closer. We made it to the edge of the property, where there was a small gate leading to the neighbor's yard. We squeezed through the gate and landed to the neighbor's house. I pounded on the door, praying someone would answer. Lights came on inside and an elderly woman opened the door. "Please help us," I gasped. "Call the police." She quickly ushered us in and locked the door. She called the police while I tried to calm the kids down. We could hear the men outside, but they didn't try to follow us into the neighbor's house. The police arrived quickly and arrested the men. They searched the Thompsons' house and found more evidence of their crimes. It turned out the Thompson had been laundering money for a criminal organization. The men who broke in with their associates looking for documents that could incriminate them. The police assured me that the kids and I were safe, but I couldn't shake the feeling of fear that had crept me that night. The Thompsons were arrested and the kids went to stay with relatives. I was hailed as a hero for protecting them, but all I could think about was how close we had come to something terrible happening. That night changed me. I never took safety for granted again, and I never babysat in a big empty house after dark ever again. I decided to sell my motorcycle. It wasn't anything fancy, but I needed the money. I put up an ad on Craigslist and waited. It didn't take long for someone to respond. His name was Mike and he seemed like a nice enough guy. We exchanged a few emails and he agreed to come over and take a look. Mike showed up right on time. He was a tall guy with a friendly smile. We chatted a bit about the bike, and he seemed genuinely interested. After a short test ride, he agreed to buy it. He handed me the cash and I gave him the keys and the title. Everything seemed fine and I was relieved. The Zala went smoothly. A few days later I started getting strange texts from Mike. He said the bike wasn't running properly, and accused me of selling him a lemon. I apologized and told him it had always worked fine for me. He didn't seem satisfied and kept sending messages. The tone of his texts got angrier, and he started accusing me of scamming him. I tried to ignore the texts, hoping he would give up, but then I started noticing a car parked outside my apartment building. It was there every night, and I had a good feeling. It was Mike. One evening as I was walking home from work, I saw the car again. This time I saw Mike sitting inside staring right at me. My heart raced and I quickly went inside, locking the door behind me. The texts from Mike continued, becoming more threatening. He said he knew where I lived and that he would make me pay. I decided to call the police. They took my report, but said there wasn't much they could do unless he actually did something that didn't make me feel any safer. The next night I heard noises outside my window. I peeked through the blinds and saw Mike in my yard looking around. I called the police again, and this time they arrived quickly. They found Mike in my yard and questioned him. He claimed he was just there to talk to me about the bike. The police warned him to stay away from me and let him go. I thought that would be the end of it, but I was wrong. The following evening I came home to find my front door slightly open. My stomach dropped. I cautiously stepped inside and saw that my place had been trashed. Trays were pulled out. Papers scattered everywhere. I called the police again, and they came to investigate. I told them about Mike, but they couldn't find any evidence linking him to the Bray-kin. I was terrified. I couldn't stay there anymore, so I packed a bag and went to stay with a friend for the next few days. I lived in fear, constantly looking over my shoulder. I didn't hear from Mike and the car outside my apartment was gone. I started to relax, thinking maybe he had given up one night. While staying in my friend's place, I woke up to a noise outside the window. I crept over and looked out. There was Mike staring right at me. I felt a wave of panic. I woke my friend and we called the police. They arrived quickly and caught Mike trying to break in this time. They arrested him. Mike was charged with stalking and attempted burglary. I had to testify in court, which was terrifying, but I was relieved when he was sentenced to jail time. After the trial, I moved to a new apartment and changed my phone number. It took a while, but I finally started to feel safe again. Looking back, I can't believe how quickly things escalated. I never expected selling a motorcycle could lead to something so terrifying. I've learned to be more cautious with transactions like that than to trust my instincts if something feels off. I had always loved camping, especially in remote places where you could really feel away from it all this time. My friends and I decided to camp in a secluded area of the Adran decks. We wanted a real adventure away from the usual spots crowded with tourists. We set up our tents near a quiet lake surrounded by dense woods. The first couple of days were perfect. Just us in nature. We hiked, fished and enjoyed the peace. On the third night we decided to split up to gather firewood before it got too dark. I wandered off figuring I knew the area well enough. As I walked deeper into the woods, the trees seemed to close in around me. I lost sight of the camp, but I wasn't worried. I had my flashlight and plenty of time to get back. After gathering a decent pile of wood, I realized it was getting darker faster than I expected. I turned to head back, but the forest seemed different. I tried retracing my steps, but nothing looked familiar. I kept walking hoping to find a landmark, but it was like the woods were shifting around me. Panic started to set in. I yelled for my friends, but my voice seemed to vanish into the trees. After what felt like hours, I saw a small cabin through the trees. Relief washed over me. Maybe someone there could help. I approached the cabin noticing it looked old and run down. I knocked on the door, but there was no answer. I tried the door and it creaked open inside. It was dark and smelled musty. I called out, but still no response. I was about to leave when I heard a noise behind me. I turned and saw a man standing in the doorway. He was tall with a wild look in his eyes. He didn't say anything, just stared at me. "I'm lost," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Can you help me get back to my camp?" He didn't answer, just stepped closer. There was something off about him. His clothes were dirty and he had a hunting knife strapped to his belt. I took a step back, my heart pounding. "I didn't mean to intrude," I said, inching toward the door. "I'll just go before I could move." He lunged at me. I ducked and ran out the door, dropping the firewood. I could hear him behind me crashing through the underbrush. I didn't know where I was going. Just that I had to get away. I ran until my lungs burned and my legs felt like they would give out. The woods were dark now and every shadow seemed to hide him. I found a large tree and crouched behind it, trying to catch my breath. I listened for any sign of him, but all I could hear was my own heartbeat. After a while, I started moving again, slowly and quietly. I needed to find my way back to camp. I thought about my friends and hoped they were okay. The fear of that man kept me moving. I stumbled onto a narrow path and decided to follow it, hoping it would lead somewhere safe. If you enjoyed this video, please subscribe and share the excitement.